The biggest question, or at least one of the biggest questions in Zelda lore, is of course which of the three timelines that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom fall into. We know most of the when in relation to other games. The question is just where or which. It has been a question that has been bugging people since Breath of the Wild came out. And I might have an answer. I might have the answer. And it is not anything new. It is not a new theory or a new discovery of any kind. It is simply a perspective that I have gotten quite recently that changed everything in how I looked at the timeline, Breath of the Wild. It gave me a brand new appreciation for everything. It made me go from hating the three timeline branches and how Breath of the Wild is so clearly vague in where it is located, to me actually loving it and thinking it is a stroke of genius, and I want to share that exact perspective with all of you, and maybe you will get a new appreciation for not just Breath of the Wild, but the timeline split as a whole. "10,000 years before Breath of the Wild, there was the event that we'll call the Great Calamity, right? And we know that this happened sometime after all the other games. So everything from the 10,000-year-old calamity until the present day, all that takes place in the distant future somewhere. And if we look in the games, there are, of course, references and elements from all three branches. And that is what makes this question so extremely hard to answer. Which timeline are we talking about here? The most popular answer and the most popular theory is simply that at one point, all three timelines merged together into one again. But to me, that has never been sitting right. That has been a very duct tape explanation. It is an incredibly huge event that we have no evidence of taking place ever. So why did Nintendo do this? Why did they make Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom so deliberately confusing when it comes to where they are located in the timeline? And I believe there are two reasons why. The first one is to cause speculation and theorizing, getting people to talk, getting people to fantasize. Because the idea of really uncovering and digging up the lore of the ancient past, the ancient history, is something that is quite fun for many people, myself included. The other reason is most likely to really free themselves from the limitations and restrictions of the three branching timeline. And so Breath of the Wild was really a response and a fix to this, but in a much better way than you might think. I believe, like many people do, that Breath of the Wild was indeed a soft reboot, but that is not a negative thing. That is not something that's bad. For many people, a soft reboot sounds like something that makes everything that came before not matter anymore. It makes it unimportant, almost as if it is non-canon. But that's not the case at all. A soft reboot is simply that it is distanced themselves to such a degree that you're no longer restricted in the same way as you were before. But that does not mean that the previous games don't matter anymore, not in the slightest. I believe, and I will explain why this is such an amazing thing, I believe Breath of the Wild was made specifically to work in any of the three timelines. Doesn't that mean that all three timelines are basically pointless? That having a timeline split at all is now completely meaningless? Not at all. Actually, quite the contrary. It enhances Breath of the Wild in many ways. Allow me to explain why. When it comes to the various references that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom make, they are actually deliberately just vague enough for them to could possibly be of previous events than we have experienced through different Zelda games, but they are just vague enough to where they might just not be. The descriptions of items or the descriptions of legends that sounds like previous games we have played are simply not specific enough. They are not detailed enough to where we can for certain really pinpoint that this is clearly and 100% from Twilight Princess or The Wind Waker or any other game from the three branches. But the thing is, we, most of the time, automatically believe that it has to be that way. That if something sounds like what we have played in Twilight Princess,
whether skyward bound, adrift in time, or steeped in the glowing embers of twilight,
then it has to be. We automatically do that, we make that connection because that sounds like that game that I have played through, this item or this story that this item tells about has to be from that game. I believe the developers knew exactly this and took advantage of it. Exactly why I think they chose to put Breath of the Wild so extremely far into the future. We are talking about at least 10,000 years of unrecorded history. And in those 10,000 years, just imagine how many heroes have come and gone, how many stories have been told, how many wars have been fought that we don't know about. For some reason, we think the games that we have played are really the only major events that has happened in this story. Of course, we don't believe that logically, but instinctively, automatically, we think so. Because we believe when a reference is made by a developer, then it has to reference something we have already experienced. Of course, that makes sense. But for example, the Dusk Bow, which we can find in Tears of the Kingdom, it tells us that it was used by a princess, presumably, very long ago to fight off beasts of twilight. Now, in the span of 10,000 plus years, in a world where the Twilight Realm, as we know it, is a very much real and important part of this universe, do you think it really is realistic that only one game, only one event, in only one of the three timelines, featured an incident, an event of some kind that featured the Twilight Realm? Do you think that is realistic in a time span of tens of thousands of years? What about the Rito? They are, as we learned from the Wind Waker, a species of birds that evolved from Sora into these Rito, which are the winged species that we see in the Wind Waker. And if they appear here in Breath of the Wild, surely they have to be the same species, right? They have to have the same origins. But do they, really? If you think about it just for a second and think about it rationally, how can we know that for sure? There is absolutely nothing that confirms to us that in the universe of Zelda, that the Rito as a species was born and created for the first time in the Wind Waker. Everything we know is that the Sora evolved into a species which are called Rito, and that's it. Just as we see in, for example, Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, there is a species of Yetis that exists in Twilight Princess. We don't see them in Ocarina of Time, but does that mean they don't exist? Or simply that we didn't encounter them in our quest? In the same way, what's to say that the Rito is not just a common term or a name of an intelligent bird species that exists elsewhere in the world as well and has existed for a long, long time? Do you see what I mean? The fact that the Wind Waker Rito were the first Rito to ever exist is only something that we had assumed. It is a place of blank information where we have just simply filled in our own information, our own assumptions, and we have done so for so long that we have believed it to just be a fact. And so when Breath of the Wild comes along and shows us a different Rito existing with other species that shouldn't exist alongside them, we think it's a contradiction, just because we think the blank that we once filled in is canon information, when it just is something that we assumed. In a similar way, we also hear about Hyrule having been, at one point, at the bottom of the ocean floor.
Legends say that long, long ago, Hyrule was actually the bottom of a vast ocean.
Shouldn't that naturally point towards this being the Great Flood of the Wind Waker? No, not necessarily. If this was really the Great Flood of the Wind Waker, it would mean that at one point, this huge ocean that was created by the gods would have to recede. I think it also just goes a bit against the theme of the Wind Waker, which is to leave the old past in the past where it belongs, letting things go. Having the old Hyrule come back up and really bringing it back to life would kind of go against that. And of course, one of the plots in the Wind Waker is that the Koroks and the Deku Tree are planting seeds all over the Great Sea in order to one day expand the islands and connect them back into one big land. So what happened to that land then? And if that land is the one we play in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, then that land was never submerged at the bottom of an ocean. It was in fact built above the ocean. So suddenly that description doesn't fit anymore. And furthermore, in Skyward Sword, in the Lanayru Sand Sea, we can actually see a map of ancient Hyrule long before Skyward Sword. And that map shows us the surface was once very much underwater, a lot of it at least. If so, couldn't Zelda's voice memories from Breath of the Wild be referring to that? Do you see the problem here? It is basically that just because we hear about a supposed flood or Hyrule being underwater, doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be the only flood that we have experienced. It is just an assumption we make because we automatically think that if there is a reference to something else, it has to be a reference to something that we have already played and experienced. But it doesn't have to be. And the huge time gap between the rest of the timeline and Breath of the Wild is exactly what allows this to happen. It is basically possible, and I think intentional, that because we have over 10,000 years of time to work with, there is space for events that sound similar to those very vague descriptions that we get to have happened in a kind of similar way. In Breath of the Wild, a lot of items were unique to Amiibo, and people assumed these were non-canon because a lot of descriptions for those items were very specific to events that we know. But in Tears of the Kingdom, when they returned, both their names and their descriptions were often changed to be more vague and be less specific. Why would that be? The Sword of the Six Sages, for example, as it was known in Breath of the Wild, had a description that was very clearly referencing the events of Twilight Princess. In Tears of the Kingdom, however, the same sword returned, now called the Dusk Claymore, and the description was changed to simply be a sword that was handed down to the royal family and the Hyrule Kingdom long ago. That doesn't really tell us much, does it? But it is clearly the same sword that was used in Twilight Princess. So, that allows that sword to both be from Twilight Princess, but also potentially the other timelines as well. Because the description doesn't lock the sword into one single event. And that happened because in Breath of the Wild, I believe indeed these were non-canon items, just Easter egg items, bonus items that you get from using Amiibos. In Tears of the Kingdom, many of these were made canon, and thus their descriptions changed to be much more vague, much more open to interpretation. Now the big question is, what does this mean? What does this imply, and why does this make Breath of the Wild and the three timeline branches good and great in the first place, as I suggested? It is not just about all three timelines being possible. It is that all three timelines are true at the same time. All three timelines all lead into Breath of the Wild. The result of each of the three branches is Breath of the Wild. All of them eventually lead to the same point. And because of this, and because of the vagueness of the information and the references we have, the chronology of events of the story of Hyrule change depending on which perspective you see it from. If you see Breath of the Wild from a child's timeline perspective, then the Dusk Claymore, and the Dusk Bow, and the reference to the Twilight by Zelda during the ceremony memory is indeed all referencing the legend of Twilight Princess events. Those things really happened. Meanwhile, Hyrule being submerged underwater at one point could have been some unseen underwater submersion through those 10,000 plus years that we don't know about, or it could even be the submersion of Hyrule in the ancient past, even before Skyward Sword. If you see it from an adult timeline perspective, then the Rito could indeed be the very same Rito, just evolved even further from the ones we see in the Wind Waker. And the great underwater submersion of Hyrule that Zelda talks about could indeed be the great flood of the Wind Waker. Meanwhile, the Dusk Claymore and the Dusk Bow could have been relics of the ancient past, where the dusk bow was used in some unseen conflict with the Twilight Realm throughout those 10,000 years. And the thing that is so amazing about this is that they have freed themselves from restrictions of the timeline without neglecting the timeline, without making one of the three timeline branches more important than the others, without making the timeline itself unimportant at all. The story of Zelda here can continue from Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom's point in the chronology, but without being restricted by the split that happened before. The Zelda team has actually taken the timeline, which previously was a problem, and made it into a literary device. They have made it into a function. Because what does it do? Each timeline is possible. Each timeline works. Each timeline is canon. All of them lead to Breath of the Wild. The difference is, which backstory do you want? What do you want the chronology of Zelda to be? And do you know what is so extremely cool about this? It is that this is so much, very much, in fact, in line with the whole style of Zelda of uncovering the past, of theorizing, of uncovering some ancient archaeological mysteries similar to the real world. It is very much in line with the whole theme of the legend of Zelda. Because Breath of the Wild marks a new beginning going forward. And Breath of the Wild thus has such a rich but yet lost history, because it is so far into the future. It has so many myths, so many legends, and so many legends and stories and myths that are lost. But thanks to the timeline split, because of the timeline split, we have actually three different options in which legends we want to be true. It is because of the timeline split and because of that distant future chronology that Breath of the Wild exists in that allows this pretty cool thing to be possible, because you, the player, us, the players, is now able to choose which legends should be true for our experience, for our playthrough. And no matter which ones of the three we choose, they are correct. They work. Because they all lead to Breath of the Wild, they all lead to Tears of the Kingdom. It is simply that the legends that are spoken of, the items that we find, the myths that are spoken of in the distant past, what those events actually are, or were rather, is what changes, based on what we choose the legends to be. And the timeline split is the three different options that we have to choose from. It is three different potential routes, paths, leading to Breath of the Wild. It is three different explanations, in fact, of the legends and myths in the Wild era. I actually think that is a very cool way to see it. The timeline split of three different paths represent three different interpretations of Breath of the Wild's myths and legends of old. And that is why Breath of the Wild never appears in any of the three branches on any graphics, because it literally happens in all three of them. And it actually gives the three timeline split a purpose. It gives them something to do. They now act as three potential contexts for the chronology of Hyrule, and more specifically the chronology and backstory of the Wild era. And do you think this has changed your perspective or your opinion and view on Breath of the Wild and the timeline as a whole? Maybe, maybe not, but at least for me, this made me actually go from thinking the timeline split is just something that maybe caused more problems than it did good, to actually really loving it and thinking that it adds to Breath of the Wild. It's actually has a purpose now. It has a function. And for that, I think Breath of the Wild did something extremely genius. I think it did something very, very good for both us, the fans, and for the developers too. I would love to hear your thoughts about this in the description. So subscribe if you want to see more videos from me regarding everything that I do. I have a massive Zelda theory in the making, which aims to explain everything. Everything from where the founding of Hyrule happens in Tears of the Kingdom to why there are two Ganondorfs and everything around this. It is some things you have never heard before, I promise you. So if you want to see that, it's going to take a little while to make. But if you want to see that and see more videos from me, make sure to subscribe. I would really appreciate that. Drop a like if you liked the video, if you had a good time. I will see you in my next video. Cheers!